Good morning. So today, what are we talking about? Hello? Hello? Can you hear me? Ceci here. Is anyone there? Hi, my name is Ceci. I'm based in Berlin, and I want to welcome you to Ceci, the podcast where you see what others see. In this, our first season, we're talking about colors. Hey Petra, how are you?
Hi, Ceci. I'm doing great. Thank you so much. We have finally come to the end of our first season dedicated to the theme colors, and we could not have dreamed of a better guest. Professor Alfonso Caramazza is Daniel and Amy Starch Professor of Psychology and Director of the Cognitive Neuropsychology Laboratory, as well as Director of the Mind-Brain Behavior Interfaculty Initiative at the Department of Psychology at Harvard University, where he has been a faculty member since 1995. He was also founding director of the Center of Mind-Brain Science at the University of Trento, Rovereto in Italy. He was born in Italy and later emigrated with his parents to Canada. In 1970, he received a BA degree in psychology from McGill University in Montreal, Canada, and a PhD from Johns Hopkins University in 1974. That same year, he joined Johns Hopkins faculty and taught first in the psychology department and then in the cognitive science department, which he helped create. In 1993, he joined the faculty at Dartmouth College as the David T. McLaughlin Distinguished Professor in the Department of Psychology. He has also held research, visiting and adjunct professorships at the University of Geneva, University of Maryland, University of Rome, La Sapienza, Concordia University, Montreal, University of Trento, among others. His research explores the nature and organization of language processing and object and action representation in the brain. In the language area, he has focused mainly on questions about the representation of word knowledge and the mechanisms of word production and recognition. He has studied these topics extensively in patients, documenting a series of dissociations within the language system in the presence of neurological injury, for example, after a stroke. In addition, his research group also explores the neural organization of language processing in healthy individuals using a variety of research techniques, including functional magnetic resonance imaging, transcranial magnetic stimulation, and behavioral techniques. Professor Caramazza has served on the advisory committee of many organizations as the Thyssen Foundation in Paris, the Mind-Brain Institute at Johns Hopkins University, the Aphasia Research Center in Boston, and the Institute of Psychology and CNR in Rome. He was editor-in-chief of Cognitive Neuropsychology from 1998 to 2009 and served as a member of the board of editors in many journals. He has been the recipient of a Javits Neuroscience Award and the Signoret Prize in the Biology of Cognition and received an honorary doctorate from the Catholic University of Louvain. He was elected to Society of Experimental Psychologists in 2004 and work has been cited more than 60,000 times. He has graciously agreed to share his time with us today, and we feel very, very lucky to have him with us today. Joining us from Cambridge, Massachusetts, please welcome Professor Alfonso Caramazza.
Professor Caramazza, good morning. Welcome.
Thank you. Good morning.
Professor, in simple terms, what is cognitive neuropsychology? What is it good for? And what would you say are its most relevant limitations?
One of the central assumptions of how the mind and brain work is that there are a number of different levels of processing that takes place when we, for example, recognize a chair or when we produce a sentence. There are many different mechanisms that are involved in these seemingly simple tasks. And the problem in studying how the mind and the brain work is that what we have is the final output of a behavior. We see the behavior. We see the kind of stimulation we give the subject to encourage them to produce, say, the name of a picture or to produce a sentence, we don't see what happens in between. And what happens in between is very complex. Neuropsychology, cognitive neuropsychology, leverages the collaboration, if you will, of nature. Sometimes brain damage results in particular deficits that reveal what has gone wrong inside that very complex system that is opaque to us. We cannot see inside. And by looking at the ways in which the behavior breaks down in individuals with these kinds of difficulties, we are able to reconstruct what the system must look like inside the head. We cannot see inside the head. All we can see is the behavior the patient produces. Let me give you an example. Suppose that I ask a person to name an object, say something like a pencil. And the damage in the brain is at a level that is looking, if you will, it's engaged in the early stages of visual analysis. If you damage that part of the brain, the patient will not be able to describe the visual representation, will not be able to see it normally. However, there are other cases where the patient looks at the pencils and says, writing. Now, in that case, the response indicates that the patient's visual system is probably intact. The patient is able to recognize that this thing has something to do with a particular function, writing. And so now we have two patients damaged in the brain, and we can look at the behavior and slowly construct all of the stages of processing that must be going on to be able to produce this very simple behavior, naming an object. So cognitive psychology relies then on a collaboration with nature in leveraging the fact that nature can produce experiments, as it were, for us, make lesion in a particular part of the brain. A lesion means damage one part of the brain. And we can then study the consequences of that damage.
Professor, it would be like having, let's say, like nature would give us a vision of a bridge, that it's incomplete, and then we would be able to say, oh, this part of the bridge is something we need to build up.
That's one good analogy. Another analogy could be the cyclotron in physics. We have very complex, say, some kind of nucleus, some kind of proton or whatever, and we cannot look inside. The physicist explodes it, and we look inside, and we can see what is going on. So nature is essentially producing for us a situation where we can look at the pieces of this whole, that is the mind, the brain, that normally functions perfectly well. All the pieces work well, but we don't know what the pieces are. And by breaking it down a bit, we can see what they are.
So these defects of the brain are essential for cognitive neuropsychology studies.
In the history of neuroscience, the vast majority of the initial insights, how the brain is organized, came from the study of brain damaged subjects. So it has had a very important role. With modern techniques, we can peek into the brain by using different kinds of instruments. But neuropsychology remains, to my mind, the most beautiful, the most important tool to unpack what the brain looks like.
Professor, how do we represent things in our brain which we do not have any physical reference from, meaning we cannot perceive them through our senses, like concepts such as friendship or freedom?
It's a very hard question. That's a good question. It's a very hard question. But before I try and answer that question, let me provide a little background. You used the word, how do we represent? What do we mean by when we say what we represent? I gave the example of naming this object. And it's a very simple task. We can all do it. But how do we go from this to the sound pencil. How do we go from this to the knowledge that I can grasp it in a particular way and use it in a particular way? Modern cognitive neuroscience and cognitive science and neuroscience assumes that we have different levels of analysis of the input. And these analysis we call or generate what we call representations. So, for example, there's a representation of the color, there's a representation of the shape, there's a representation of its size, perhaps of its implicit weight. There are a number of bits of information that are being processed up to the point where I can produce a response that I grasp it this way. I don't grasp it this way. Why do I grasp it this way? Because I must have information in the brain that says that this thing is used in a particular way. All of those things so-called, all those different levels have what we call representations. So go now to your question of how do we represent concepts that don't have external physical reference. That's very hard, and there's much debate in our field. So let's do the simple one first. How do we represent, say, cup? Well, one assumption is that we have, as I said, in the case of pencil, the information about the shape of the object, the fact that it's made of a substance that has a particular weight. If it's made of lead, it would be very hard to lift it, and you wouldn't be able to drink from it. There's all kinds of information that we represent. And so the concept cup will be able to make contact with this information that we have through the senses. We know its shape, we know its size, we know the material substance it's made of, we know how it's used. And so one can say that our knowledge of something concrete like cup makes contact with all of this kind of knowledge that we get through the senses. And then you ask me, well, how do we represent freedom? Well, that's a question that the field hasn't quite come to agreement as to how we represent it. Certainly, language plays an important role. So the way in which we come to understand freedom, the way we talk about freedom, is by us giving explanations that we give explanation through language. So there's a network, if you will, all kinds of relations that we have about the relationship between, say, something freedom, and then someone says, well, freedom means also that you can do what you want, and so on. We can construct a representation, if you will, of a knowledge of an abstract concept like freedom, but looking at the kinds of relations it has with other concepts. So the meaning of freedom emerges from the relationship of this particular concept to other concepts that we have about the world, about our experiences. However, it does not have a physical reference. It doesn't have a particular representation in the sensory motor system. Now, this is one view. There's a view that is called embodied cognition, which tries to, it argues that our concepts are actually embedded in our sensory motor experiences. So even something as abstract as freedom would be embedded in the sensory motor world, in the sensory motor experiences, in the sensory motor structures of the brain. I find it hard to understand that theoretical perspective, but I think that we can analyze it. We can see whether this theory actually succeeds by considering perhaps cases like the blind, who don't have access to certain sensory information, and we can ask how do they represent concepts if they're blind. Concepts like red, or concepts like rainbow, do they have a representation of these things? is their conceptual machinery, just like the machinery that people who have the sensory experience represent as concepts. So how do we represent these abstract concepts? We don't have a very good idea, but we assume that it must have something to do with the ways in which a particular notion is embedded in a complex network of other ideas. And so the meaning then comes from the relation of that particular piece in that network, in that big structure, from its relationship to all the other things that we have in that network.
Professor, talking about this network, what happens when we do have some reference, let's say through our senses, but nevertheless, this concept also evolves in time? Let's take red roses as an example. Red in a rose is a characteristic of a certain kind of rose, but it might also carry various meanings of knowledge acquired over time. Let's say from Greek mythology to literature to Christian symbols, there is a meaning to the red rose. One of the symbols is romantic love or courtship. Even back in the 17th century, this idea was already old. As Edmund Waller's famous song, Go Lovely Rose, suggests, Go lovely rose, he says, tell her that wastes her time in me, that now she knows when I resemble her to thee, how sweet and fair she seems to be. Now, even the rose alone, without being red, could also signify beauty or the beloved. Professor, is this kind of information in different compartments of the brain, or is it more like a ball of snow building into various levels or layers of meaning?
This is a beautiful, hard question. There's some controversy in the field again. There are always controversies in sciences. There's a distinction that is made between semantic knowledge and more broadly conceptual knowledge. So semantic knowledge is the knowledge, that part of meaning that we associate with a particular word. So rose is just rose. Rose is a flower. It has those kinds of characteristics. Now, there's all kinds of stuff about rose, though, that is not really the meaning of rose. So, or the way we understand the meaning of rose. So, for example, we know roses are sold in stores, in particular in flower shops. That's not a defining characteristic of rose. It's something that our culture has. And some of these things are not very interesting, like the fact that we know that roses are sold in stores. We know that the price of roses is roughly whatever. There's a whole bunch of stuff we know about roses. And then there is the information like the one you said, red, which seems to be much more closely related to the meaning of rose. What we understand by rose, the conceptual presentation of rose. That it's a flower, and that it has, in our cultures, is used in a particular way to indicate affection, indicate various kind of possible use of that rose to communicate certain kinds of feelings. Is that the meaning of rose? As I said, people would disagree exactly where you should draw the boundaries of what you call the meaning of rose versus what you call the knowledge you have on your culture of rose. But that is certainly something that is part of the ways in which our brain reacts. Let me give you an analogy to something totally unrelated from flowers and roses, and that is something that comes from a very different, from a disorder of brain damage, where there are patients who have lost the ability to recognize a person, faces. So there's a disorder called prosopagnosia. You may have heard of this. Patients who cannot recognize this. You look at the face, including the face of a loved one, including their own faces in the mirror, and they don't recognize them. However, it has been shown that even when a patient does not recognize explicitly that person, there is an emotional response, and we can measure that. There is an autonomic response that we measure in the person that indicates that despite the denial of knowing who the person is, their emotional system is working. Okay, so we connect then the meaning of these things to our emotional experience, our emotional world. Now, going back, so there is clear evidence that the two can be separated, but that they are part of each other. Now, going back to your example of rose and red, it's the same thing. So red roses may actually generate emotions in particular cultures, and that is part of, if you will, the emotional aspect of the meaning of roses. How do we represent that? We don't know exactly how we represent it, but there must be a connection between different parts of the brain, the system that is involved in capturing emotions, and the system that is involved in knowing how to grasp a rose, how to use it, when to give it. That kind of knowledge is part of the whole things we know about rose, but they're organized in pieces, as you were saying.
Professor, language is based on symbols used to represent concepts in the world. We learned from a previous interview with Dr. Gavin Evans that color perception is in big part determined by the language we speak because of the many nuances of identifying objects across cultures. As an example, there are languages that have names for the spectrum's basic colors, while others only define colors by dark or light, and some others categorize, for example, blue into different shades. So language and the names given to colors in terms of their assessment seems to be greatly relevant. Does this mean that someone with a greater color literacy can identify more colors in the spectrum?
I mean, they can certainly label them, they can categorize them, but if we were to ask the question, is the sensitivity to color differences different? The answer is no. This has been a very controversial issue for years about whether or not our language creates categories in the world, which then, as a consequence, affect how we perceive the world. As I already said, indeed, in Italian we have the word celeste, which we don't have in English. In English you have blue, light blue, dark blue, but we have categories that are pretty clear. I don't think I see colors differently from my colleagues down the hall who don't speak Italian. So yes, going back to the question that may I call you? You call each other Ceci and Petra. I live in America. We don't call people by their surname. Ceci, if I may call you
please.
Ceci. Ceci, example she gave about red roses. It could be that in fact, if we then look at how language experience, the colors we have, and we associate them with certain kinds of cultural practices, would have emotional consequences. So yes, a person who has different color system in a different language, and that language then associates particular colors with particular kinds of practices and feelings and so on, that will differ from culture to culture, but not the perceptual system itself.
It's a common understanding that there are children or people in general that are recognized as being, between quotation marks, talented in speaking or easily learning different languages, or regarding their mother tongue. It's often connected to a talent for music, or at least to a good sense of rhythm. Does language have its own compartment in the brain, and is talent, so to say, for languages detectable in the brain?
One of the most heated debated issues in cognitive science is precisely the question you raise, and that is there something about language that is innately given? I'm of the opinion that unless you had a brain organized the way a human brain is organized, unless you had the kind of genetic backup and experiences that we have had as a species, you wouldn't be able to speak. So dogs don't speak. They bark. We think that they're clever, that my dog barks at me in particular ways when he wants something. And I can see that there's some attempt to communicate. But the question of how language comes about seems to be very strong evidence, according to a particular group of scientists in this area, that we become equipped with specialized mechanisms for acquiring language. Just like we become equipped to see colors the way we see colors. I'm not sure if I've answered your question at the level that you wanted, but please rephrase it if I didn't.
No, we haven't. We can ask if you had any experience with language ability and its connection to music or rhythm. Maybe.
Oh, yes. Yes. I mean, there are clearly huge differences in linguistic ability, just like there are huge differences in playing basketball, and there are huge differences in running, and just there are huge differences of all sorts. I'm a good example of that. I've been in English-speaking countries since I was 12, so that's 64 years ago. And I still have a terrible accent. There's no way I seem to be able to get rid of my Italian accent. And I know people who spent 5 years in the United States and they speak just like other Americans. So there are individual differences, huge individual differences at all levels. At the low level of articulation and production of speech, but also at the level of mastery of language, a facility to write and to express oneself. Those are important differences. They're very large, but we all speak and we all communicate. Just that there are some variation. Just like we don't begrudge the fact that there are, I don't know, recently you've seen, I'm sure, the tennis championships, the tennis games, that there are some players who seem to be able to perform miraculous hits. You don't know how it's possible, whereas others cannot do it. It's the same thing with language.
When we were doing the questions, Petra was just mentioned, because there's this theory, and maybe it's just like a myth or something, that people that have this ability to speak a lot of languages is also good in dancing or has a very good sense of rhythm or music. Do you know something about this, or is just
if there's a connection?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if you frame it that way, I could be perhaps evidence that theory may be right. I'm not good at rhythm. I'm not good at dancing. I don't see that. Of course, we are so ignorant about so many things that for me to say categorically that is nonsensical it would be inappropriate. But it's not obvious to me how that link comes about. How motor dexterity would translate into linguistic facility. I mean, there are people who are born with impaired motorically, and they speak perfectly fine. I mean, their language skills are just as developed as anyone else's.
Professor, can you explain us why it is easier for children versus adults to learn a new language?
There's a theory that says that biologically we are organized to acquire language, and if we don't exercise that faculty when we are especially tuned to be able to acquire language, that ability is somehow reduced. Not everyone agrees with that view. Not everyone agrees with the view that there are so-called critical periods, that we have to acquire things in a particular time window to be able to use those things, acquire those skills efficiently. Some people think that there are no such things as critical periods. Empirically, it's true that people acquire language at any age. People acquire a new language when they're 80. They don't acquire it as well as young children acquire it, not as fast it seems, but that could be because of general cognitive slowing. It's not necessarily that the linguistic faculty is not functional. But I think the vast majority of research points to a greater facility for acquisition when you're young. It may have to do with simple things like the fact that when you're young, you acquire language in a context where you're not nervous, you're not anxious. As an adult, it's very hard to try and speak a language that you don't know, and you are constantly embarrassed of the kinds of errors you make. As a child, you don't even know that. You simply produce language just like everyone else, and so acquisition is faster. But empirically, it's true that you acquire language more easily as children.
I remember a teacher telling me, Professor Caramazza, that the children, they do not fear to make mistakes when they're learning versus adults.
Right. Is it different from learning how to ski? My children learned how to ski, and they would fall and they would never cry. I always thought that the reason was that they are small and they're short. So when they fall, the distance they fall is not that bad. When I fell as an adult trying to learn how to ski, I was scared to death. So I never became a good skier. So perhaps there are those. So here's a case where a cognitive faculty is penetrated by emotional systems, where things like fear, embarrassment, whatever actually interferes with the process of learning.
Professor, talking about this fantastic plasticity or flexibility of the brain and these many compartments and networks, you conducted a study of a woman whose brain was damaged by stroke and had later trouble to name things like a chair or could not make typical color object associations, such as a banana typically being yellow, but could provide detailed properties of these objects, and furthermore, she could identify all colors in a color chart without a problem. So how is this possible? Could you talk to us about this case and what were the results you obtained from it?
Our brain is organized into systems, different systems. So there's the visual perceptual system. But then the visual perceptual system itself is organized into a number of distinct processes or components. One of the things we know is that color is processed, for example, separately, differently from things like, say, shape. And there are disorders, brain damage disorders, where you can damage one component of this complex system while sparing others. One well-known disorder is a disorder called achromatopsia. Achromatopsia is when a patient is unable to recognize colors. So you show the patient, say, blue, red, and the patient cannot tell you which is red, which is blue, cannot, makes all kinds of errors in recognizing colors. Now, that is a disorder of the perception of color. Now, we report a patient who did not have achromatopsia. She was able to discriminate colors perfectly well. And if you show her, say, a red ball, she would recognize it to be red and to be a ball. However, if we then tested her knowledge of color of objects, that knowledge was damaged, while knowledge of other aspects of objects were not. So this means that not only do we have the system that separates in the early perceptual process color from other properties, but that knowledge is also separated or distinguishable at higher levels of representation. So this patient that you mentioned was impaired at knowing, did not able to say that the banana was yellow or the carrot was orange, but if he's shown an orange object, would say that's orange. Shown a yellow object, would say that is yellow. So again, this I think is one way to illustrate that there are multiple levels of representation. So we have the earliest levels when we the eyes get the information from the actual physical world, then a more complex interpretation of that information until it becomes very abstract, and then it becomes something like you mentioned, red roses, where you also associate emotional aspects, you associate other kinds of knowledge.
Professor, sorry to be so repetitive, but this is so interesting. I'm going to take again this example of the red rose. So it would be fair to say that a person with normal sight capability would be, let's say, storing the color red in different compartments, as we have been learning. So that there is, let's call it compartment, but like one level or compartment for the color red experienced through our senses. So in this case, literally seeing the color red. And then there would be other level of compartment for different symbolic meanings, like we said, courtship, or the idea of the Virgin Mary being so delicate like a rose. But then also, lastly, you were talking about this example of not recognizing the faces, but being producing some emotions or associating some emotions to a person. So then there would be a more individual for each person's compartment where positive or negative memories and emotions that are provoked from a concept are stored. So let's say a rose given or received as a symbol of love or friendship could be positive for somebody, but then for another one that I don't know, was an unrequited love, we'd always associate this rose with something negative.
Right. I may have misspoken. I did not want to say that that the knowledge of color is stored separately from other kinds of knowledge. What I wanted to say is that the ways in which the different components in the brain interact may result in impairments of a specific kind of knowledge without it necessarily being stored separately. So just to go back to the case of color, one could say that the problem with the ways in which color knowledge is represented is that it gets inputs from parts of the low-level processing system that is distinct from other parts of information, and then the interaction of some deficit at that level will affect selectively or disproportionately color.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? That what it suggests is that the knowledge is structured, but not that necessarily there are little pieces of the brain, each of which represents a different kind of knowledge.
Okay.
I do not want to say that.
Mm-hmm.
But going back to your broader question, yeah, that's a beautiful analysis you've made. There are all those kinds of experiences that we have in the world, and those experiences clearly have, many of them have emotional features, and that information would be activated when we activate the part, say, for example, the word. Think of it this way. Think of it as a network that things are tied. So here I have a node that is the sound of the word. Here I have information about meanings. Here I have the emotional reactions I have about this and so on. So if I take any one of these nodes and I pull it, I'm going to pull everything else. Everything's going to come together in different degrees as a function of how distant they are from it, how strong the representation is, how much experience we have. But as you point out, we cannot dissociate our knowledge of one thing from other knowledge of the same thing. So knowing that a red rose has certain kinds of emotional features, that you cannot put it aside. It may not come out strongly, and it depends on context. You're watching a sad movie, and all of a sudden you see a red rose, and you start crying because you said your lover was away. There are these kinds of all these pieces being tied together. How are these things represented? How are they organized? that is something that the field is struggling to make sense of.
Okay. Professor, there was this study you co-authored with postdoctoral fellow Ella Streim-Amit from Georgetown University and Xiaoying Wang and Yan Xiao Bi, both from Beijing Normal University, published in Nature Communications in December 2018. This fascinating study suggests that although they experience color differently from the sighted, blind are still able to, between quotation marks, see color. Again, how is this possible? How can a born blind person be able to represent something in the brain that is purely in at the beginning of the cognitive perception, a visual experience?
Yes, this is. By the way, Ella Streim-Amit is no longer a postdoc. She is a professor now at Georgetown University, the study that we did was to try to understand how we organize our knowledge of words when the meaning has a sensory referent in people who are not blind, but does not have a sensory referent when a person doesn't have vision and therefore cannot experience, doesn't have the sensory experience of redness, say, or blue. And it's been known for a long time, at least since the 1960s, I believe, when Marmer and Shepard and others studied the knowledge that blind people have of color. And you can organize the knowledge of words, of colors, in what is called a color wheel. That is the similarity between two colors in relation to each other. And so we know that red is more similar to orange than red is to blue, say. And we can look at the relationship among colors and sort of create a spatial map of how they relate to each other. So red and orange will be close in space, blue will be further away, right? And what these researchers did behaviorally, they asked blind individuals to tell them how similar two colors were. And then they constructed the spatial representation, and what they found was that it's just like that of people who are sighted. Now, that is an exaggeration, there are distortions. It's not exactly right. There are individual differences. For some people, they did not get a good color representation. But for some, it was just perfect. It was essentially the color circle. So the question becomes, how did they get it? Well, the human mind is an amazing thing. It's just we are constantly computing relationships among things. So if you asked me to pick something. If I pick the red one, and I mistakenly take the orange one, you say, well, that's not red, that's the orange. I'm not unlikely to pick a blue one if you ask me to take the red one. So we have lots and lots of experience from the language that gives us information about how similar they are to each other. And what we wanted to do was to ask the question, where is this information represented in the blind? And what we found is that when you have blind individuals answer questions about things like a rainbow, whose meaning depends on color, there's an area of the brain that represents this information in the blind, and it is the same or very close to the area where we represent information about things like virtue and things like freedom. So the color representation in the blind is in the area where we represent abstract concepts for the sighted. So this is a demonstration that you can have a representation and knowledge of color in the blind, but it does not have a sensory referent. It doesn't activate the posterior parts of the brain where color information in the sighted is also activated. I don't know if this is clear. So what we've done is we have taken a concept, red, that has a sensory component in the sighted, and shown that that information in the blind is represented in an area of the brain where we represent abstract knowledge.
Professor, saying that, you make me think that it has been incredible that we have been talking throughout 12 chapters about a topic that at the beginning of our search, we thought it would only be captured if we had seen it before, the colors I'm talking about. But the truth is, we have been hearing about much elaborated concepts through all our interviews that had been associated with color. So our audience has not been using their sense of sight, because this is an audible podcast that thought to be essential to color, but rather we all have been using the sense of hearing while talking about color. So yeah, that's fascinating.
Right. So going back to the analogy I gave of a whole bunch of little nodes, strings connected to each other, we have this representation. So we have the sound red. Well, red is not red, doesn't have any properties of redness, right? But when I hear the word red, I generate or I make contact with this other information, as you point out. And the question is, though, this brings to mind something that you have not asked me about, and that is visual imagery. I don't know if you, in your earlier podcast, you talked about visual imagery. There are people who are very good at imaging. So you ask them to image red, and they image red. They close their eyes and they see red. You ask them to image a car, and they image a car. And then you have, at the other extreme, you have people with so-called aphantasia. Aphantasia people who don't have visual imagery. Okay? I am borderline aphantasia. I'm very poor at visual imagery. So going back to your question, the fact that people have visual imagery suggests that when I hear a word, I actually generate not just its abstract meaning, but also perhaps activates these more sensory motor areas that represent that information. So if you're talking about red roses, are you a good imager?
I think Petra is a very good imager. Yes.
Okay. So when I said red roses, did you image right away a particular hue of red?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay? I don't, but you do, right? And so that's activated, and you can see how this information is. So all these parts of the brain are connected. One of the most difficult problems we have is to figure out how the brain manages to silence, if you will, certain parts so they don't interfere with our ongoing activity. As I am speaking with you, I don't want my visual imagery to interfere with my speaking. At the same time, it is there in the background and can sort of raise its head above water if an issue comes up, like when I asked you about, did you have an image? And you said, yes, a particular hue of red. But it's there in the background, and it's not really part of the conversation. It's not part of the core conceptual information we are communicating.
The scenography.
Yeah.
Professor, we would like to ask you a completely different question, a more general question. It's about computers. We know that computers can surpass human intelligence on many levels. And I would like to ask you, what would you say are the main differences between human intelligence and artificial intelligence? And what would it be that human brains could do best versus a computer?
I would, first of all, challenge that computers can do are more intelligent than humans. That I challenge. It's not. They are better performing certain kinds of tasks. Undoubtedly, they can beat chess players. The best chess players have been knocked down by certain computer programs. We know that now with the current models of AI, the computers can recognize objects of all sorts, and they can recognize and distinguish faces and so on. I think that the major limitation of computers is that they don't have the flexibility that we have, the flexibility of being able to jump from one thought to the other, to be able to, they are structured, they have their programs in place, they have computational systems that are structured, and they can do those much better than any one of us can at that task. Can those systems be damaged, quote unquote, the way we are damaged when we have brain damage? If we were to try and disrupt one of the systems, will it produce garbage, or will it break down the way in which we break down and compensate for the limitations that we have? So yes, computers are amazing, and perhaps one day, there's so many smart people working on these problems, we'll actually be able to come up with brand new, beautiful solutions. But right now, I think that the major difference is the flexibility of the human mind, the fact that we can perform all kinds of tasks. So those amazing computers that are great at understanding language probably won't be able to play soccer.
Yeah, that's an experiment I saw, that small robots were playing soccer, or they tried to play soccer, and they didn't have the coordination. So they were falling and couldn't get up.
And you mentioned that it was a ball that was blue colored, and when the color blue was out of the fields, then if you put a yellow ball or anything, then they didn't recognize it.
Yeah. It was really interesting. Yeah.
But as I said, these limitations may be only temporary. That is, they're constructing better and better systems with more and more. But one of the problems is that they have to be trained for incredibly long time to be able to perform those things. But then those are pretty much dedicated systems. And whether or not they can generalize to other kinds of things is an open question. I simply want to say that I am in awe of what has been accomplished. It's not a criticism of what's been accomplished. It's just amazing. Whether or not this is the way the human mind works, the brain works, that's a very different story.
I just wanted to go back to this study that you performed with the professor of Georgetown and your colleagues of university in China. We were wondering if during this study, was it possible for you and your colleagues to physically track the activity of the brain while asking the addressed sighted and blind persons about the different colors? Could you describe the process? I mean, if it's easy to understand.
No, the method we used doesn't allow us to look at the time course of processing. The method we used is called, the abbreviation is fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging. And that approach allows us to see which parts of the brain are activated in response to certain stimuli. We don't have information about the time course of activation and how it generates new kinds of representations along the way. There are other approaches that look at the temporal characteristics of brain processing. One is called magnetoencephalography, where you use a system where you're looking at the magnetic responses in the brain, but you can look at it temporally, look at the time course of this process. We have not done those kinds of studies. I'm not familiar with anyone who's done these kinds of studies on this problem. It would be beautiful to try and do that. I wish if someone is listening who is a scientist, that they would to do it if they had access to one of these machines to be able to do that. We were not able to do that.
This is incredible. Professor, we would like to close our interview and this season with a question left for you by one of our previous guests, Alavi Lutz, a professor for both anesthesiology at the Charité in Berlin and the Institute of Healthcare at the Technical University of Berlin. During our episode, The Healing Power of Color, Professor Lutz talked about the revolution taking place in intensive care medicine for about already 10 years now. This change of mind approach aims to no longer keep patients under sedation, but rather awake and conscious to make patients part of their own recovery. This with the main objective of preventing and healing post-operative delirium, which untreated can cause death and cognitive problems. In this context, a team within the CC7 of Berlin's Charities Intensive Care Unit, of which Professor Lutz is part of, developed a human-centered all-around project called parametric space design. And patients treated in rooms built under this concept experience a soothing and free of cable soundproof environment that incorporates illuminating ceilings that cover in whole the site of the patients. And these ceilings incorporate a software too that it's individually tailored and constantly actualized by hospital staff, which can enter parameters and luminous areas to create images of moods of light according to patients' individual needs to help them in their recovery process. This project has been proved to lower the cases of post-operative delirium in 50% in comparison to patients being treated in common intensive care rooms. The concept is, of course, dynamically developing, and there is a wish to further include other elements to these created environments, such as sound and smell, to help patients recover with the less medication and sedation possible. So now we will hear Professor Lutz's question.
It's a very great research Professor Caramazza is doing. I read with great interest his publication about the topic of how blind can see color. So actually, I was wondering, because in this publication, he mentioned that blind patients can get a perception of colors in the way or in areas of the brain where sighted people normally get a perception for abstract concepts like, for example, justice. And I was wondering, if you have a sighted person in the intensive care unit, which has perceiving colors through the normal way, is there a way that we can modify this perception throughout speech in a way that adjusts the perception of color? So somehow, how can these both systems of perception interact?
It's impressive that they've been able to create an environment that seems to help these patients. So congratulations, and it's very great news for people who are ill and have to undergo surgery. We did not argue that blind patients perceive color. I think perhaps there may be some difference between sort of the use of perception in German and English. But perception we mean something where you have sensory experiences of color. Blind people don't have, but they do. You're correct that they do activate areas of the brain that normally seem to be activated by abstract concepts. But your question at the end seemed to be, can one add language information, say name, colors, and so on, to augment or in some way affect the visual experience of color in these patients? And I have to confess I don't know how to answer that question. It is possible, and perhaps even likely, that seeing colors and hearing color information would actually accentuate and sharpen and enrich the experience of color we get through the visual modality. Precisely how that would work, however, I don't know, and I'm not sure how it would affect the feeling that people have of color. But our knowledge of these interactions is so poor that I actually do not want to venture in saying that it would not help. It could help, precisely how, however, I don't know. I just want to add one thing. I don't know if you have time still. There's one project that we published in Neuron, I think a year or two ago, with my collaborators in Beijing. Yan Xiaobi was a former student of mine at Harvard, but now is a senior professor at Harvard in China, and Xiaoying Wang. We studied again color in blind individuals, a much more detailed study. And what we found there in the study is that the activation of color in these abstract areas in the blind is also found in the sighted. That is, when a sighted person understands the color red or sees the perception red, they also activate the same area that we find in the blind. So you sighted individuals, you have the sensory experience of color, but you also have the abstract knowledge of color, its relation to other things, like we were saying, to roses and so on. And that knowledge seems to be represented in these anterior areas of the temporal lobe. The difference between the two groups is that whereas in the blind, that activation is not connected to sensory areas, we found that in the sighted, this area, this abstract color area, is directly connected with visual areas in the perception system. Okay. So the blind have activation of color, but it's not something miraculous and strange and different. It's exactly what we have. What is missing for them is the connection of that experience, that knowledge, to the sensory experience of color. So in a way, we are starting to understand the relationship between the sensory information and the more abstract information in the case of.
Amazing. Professor, we have come to an end, and we want to thank you for your kindness in having shared with us a bit of your extensive knowledge. It was a pleasure and an honor.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Caramazza, for this fascinating closing episode. Please be sure to check this chapter's descriptions to find more about Professor Caramazza's work and all the fantastic research taking place at the Cognitive Neuropsychology Laboratory at Harvard, which he directs. Thank you to our audience, and thank you, Ceci. This season, Colors has been a great ride.
Thanking you, Petra. You have been a wonderful co-host throughout the whole season. And thank you also to Dorit Elkenati, who co-hosted the opening episode for this season. And thank you, our listeners, wherever you are, for having allowed us to share time with you. We hope to have expanded your intellectual landscape on colors, as we have expanded ours too. And as you said, Petra, it has truly been a fun, wonderful ride. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.